We need to rethink our core assumptions about how business and society work. We need to prepare for post-labor economics. What happens to our economy when human labor is no longer its central input? What happens to companies when efficiency keeps rising, when much less employees are needed, but customers lose purchasing power? And what are business leaders supposed to do when automation improves productivity, but through unemployment undermines the very demand their businesses depend on? These are no longer theoretical questions. In this conversation, I'm joined by David Shapiro and Dalibor Petrovic. David Shapiro is one of the leading thinkers on artificial intelligence and what he calls post-labor economics. For years, he's been analyzing the long-term decoupling of productivity, wages, and employment, and the question why AI and robotics may bring this trend to a terminal point. Dalibor Petrovic brings more than 3 decades of global business experience, including over 20 years as a senior partner at Deloitte. He's worked closely with owners, boards, CIOs and CTOs, and technology leaders across industries and regions, and focuses on what this transition really means for enterprises, governance, and leadership responsibility. This conversation is also a preview of their upcoming book, to be released in May or June, which lays out the full framework behind post-labor economics and what leaders, policymakers, and families need to do to navigate this transition responsibly. Let's get into it. Dalibor, David, your book is about the great decoupling. If you could put it in 1 or 2 sentences for a busy CEO of a mid-sized company, how would you put it?
In the simplest possible terms, the great decoupling is about the observation that productivity and wages or labor input have been decoupling for about the last 7 decades. And technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics are merely going to accelerate that trend and to, we believe, a terminal point where there is a final uncoupling between labor inputs and GDP in the long run. And then what we explore is not just how that's happening, why it's happening, the statistics to back it up, but then also what do you do about it? Because the primary problem is, some people are afraid that it'll destroy capitalism entirely. We don't believe that. But the primary problem is that right now, consumption-based economies are driven almost entirely by household spending. Well, household spending is predicated upon wages from labor. So if you run out of labor or wages from labor and you don't need employees anymore, then you have aggregate household income and household demand declines. And then nobody wins because then tax bases dry up and consumers dry up and people, lose their homes and get hungry. So how do we refactor the whole economy around this new reality? That's why we call it post-labor economics, is the theory that we're proposing in this book.
Dalibor, what's the overarching purpose of your corporation with David?
I bring to this conversation 3 decades of very, I would say, rich and varied business experience. My last 2 decades were with Deloitte, world's largest professional service firm, where I was a senior partner. And through that, I have had the pleasure and the privilege of experiencing different industries, different geographies across the world. As part of my job at Deloitte, I was leading a very specific portfolio focused on chief technology officers and chief information officers. I saw where this is going, but when I came across David Shapiro, he actually put the words that I was feeling into concrete story that actually made sense. And then I realized, this is actually very, very important. It's a big problem. It's a societal problem. It's actually a civilizational problem. It is I think a very unique, complex system issue where the transition that is upon us is almost inevitable simply because of the economic forces in the way our society and economy has been constructed. I believe this is an inevitable scenario that's going to play itself out over the next number of years. And for us to preserve not just functional economy, but quite frankly, peace and cohesion of society, we have to be thinking about what do we do about this at the national levels? What do policymakers do? What do companies do? How do businesses react? And also, how do individuals and families react? So David's theory delves deeply into the policymakers' recommendations and family recommendations. My role is to work with David to help us unlock, what do businesses do? What should be the mindsets of the ownership group, shareholder group, the board and governance? How do we navigate through this for the enterprise in a way that is going to be beneficial to most humans that will be impacted by this transition?
Some of the people in our audience might be positivists, so they want to see evidence that it's really happening, that it's structural, not cyclical. What are the most convincing data points or patterns that show that we're really facing a structural post-labor shift rather than just another wave of technological unemployment?
This is critical, and I definitely appreciate anyone who wants to say, show me the evidence and show me the numbers. So there's a variety of data points that we look at as evidence that this is a secular trend, not a business cycle. One of those numbers is prime age population, prime age employed population, which has been declining, particularly of men. And my data is mostly American, just because it's where I'm at, and that's where most of. However, a lot of these findings are replicated by ILO and OECD and other organizations. So I do want to acknowledge my American bias here. But with that being said, prime age male population has been declining for 7 decades. So that is a pretty alarming trend. Now, it hasn't declined much. It was at about 97%, and now it's at about 89%. So that's not catastrophic yet, but it's not moving in the right direction. Likewise, total labor force participation rate peaked in about the year 2000. And a big reason for that is because of policy changes that encouraged women to enter the workforce and enter college in the 70s and 80s. So that peaked in about 2000, but it has been in decline ever since for about the last 2 decades or so. So basically, we have seen a reversal of that trend. So people are checking out of the workforce permanently. We've also seen structural increases in gigification of marginally attached workers and of discouraged workers, particularly over the last 10 to 20 years. And that's not reversing. In fact, the numbers about the number of people that are freelancers or gig workers is staggering. Up to 65 million Americans are gig workers or part-time workers. And that's just not sustainable. That's not the full-time employment of the American dream that we had been promised. And that's just a few of the top line statistics. There's many, many other variables and statistics, but those are what I feel like are the most compelling, showing the historical trend of automation. Now, to cast that forward, we look at the rise of automation in the form of artificial intelligence and humanoid robotics. Those are on the horizon. Of course, artificial intelligence is in its infancy today, but it's improving rapidly and constantly. And it has proven to be one of the most formidable general purpose technologies that we've seen basically since electricity and the internet, which means it's only going to continue to improve, and it's only going to continue to become more pervasive and more embedded everywhere. Now, the thing is, it's already at parity with most human experts, but it's only getting better from here in terms of memory, autonomy, and those sorts of things. Then humanoid robots is the 1-2 punch that's coming down the pipeline. We've seen the first humanoid robots entering into factory floors and warehouses, but that technology is also rapidly improving. Just when you look at the investment that's going into it, hundreds of billions of dollars going into data centers, GPUs, humanoid robots. And it's not just America, it's globally. It's Japan, it's China, it's America, it's Germany. Everyone is going all in on these technologies. And typically, where that level of investment goes, improvements then follow. Now, what we're really tracking is a tipping point, which is the hourly cost or total cost of ownership of those new systems based on the outcomes that they can generate versus the cost of humans. And so what happens is you get network effects. So at a certain point, it's cheaper and better to use the AI or the robot than it is to use a human. And then once you get to that point, it's almost a step change because humans are better until they're not, and then they're not better at all. And so then you end up with what's called labor substitution. And so what we and others, it's not just me, by the way, plenty of other economists and thinkers anticipate kind of these network effects of labor substitution happening in sudden shifts. Now, of course, there's the larger an organization is, the more inertia there is. It takes time to replace systems. It takes time to go through layoffs and whatever other structural changes. And of course, the same is also true for states and nations, where there's just a certain amount of inertia, whether it's policy inertia or just employment statistics and that sort of thing. But at the same point, what we are anticipating based on technological trends is that within 2 or 3 years, that calculus is going to shift pretty dramatically. And so then it's a matter of what we kind of anticipate is businesses are going to be racing as fast as they can to lay off as many people as they can. Why? Because their competitors are doing the same thing. And we're already seeing some of this. We're seeing the first kind of trickles with call centers and HR and a few other jobs kind of just being wholesale shuffled off, sometimes firing 90% of certain departments. So that's a hint of what's to come, because again, those technologies are only improving, and they're improving by leaps and bounds, not slow increments.
Dalibor, why are you so confident that this is really happening?
When you think about what do we as humans bring into the workforce, into the labor force, there are 4, as David calls them, food groups of categories that we actually offer into the workforce. We first and foremost offer strength, right? We have strength, we can lift and carry things. We offer dexterity, so that's fine movement, precise and fine movement. We offer cognition, our intelligence, intellect, knowledge, right? And empathy, our emotional expression. Every single job anywhere in the world, from being a bricklayer to a heart surgeon, is effectively a combination of these 4 skills. Yeah. Now, history also teaches us that whenever we can do things better, faster, cheaper, or safer using some form of technology, that results in displacement of a human task by the task of that automation and that technology. So if you consider that Industrial Revolution 1, 200, 300 years ago, actually automated our strength, that from the late 60s up until now, we have robots actively deployed in factories that is sort of tackling the dexterity and strength combination. What we are experiencing now actually is, for the first time ever, cognition and empathy is now being encroached by artificial intelligence, alien intelligence, let's call it, silicon intelligence. If we play this movie forward, it to me looks quite obvious that eventually automation will fully replace both our dexterity, cognition, and ultimately empathy, right? So that's essentially the basis of David's post-labor economic theory.
People buy the physical part. People buy the cognitive part. People tend not to buy the emotional and the empathy part. How do you justify that?
That's a great question. And it really strikes at kind of what's going to remain. So while there are dimensions of scarcity, and you can look at it from the basis of physics, where mass, distance, time, and energy are some of the primary constraints that always figure into economics. Here's how I came up with that. To answer your question is, when you look at the supply side, the labor supply side, it's very difficult to say, okay, well, what will machines do that humans will be able to do better? In the long run, you say, okay, well, robots are stronger, they're faster, they can already do parkour. I can't do a backflip. Can you do a backflip? Humanoid robots can already do that. They can dance better. They can fight better. They have better precision. They have sub-millimeter precision in their ability to grasp and manipulate. So when you look at the supply side, it's very difficult to say, well, where are humans going to be better? And then the other side, though, is demand side. So you say, okay, well, on the demand side, what is it that humans will actually pay for, assuming that machines are going to be better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans? And that's where we look at the what I'm coming to call the attention, the meaning, authenticity, and experience axis. So there are places where humans will prefer to have another human: live music, sports, athletes, celebrities, other in-person events. If you go to a coffee shop, you probably want to talk to a real barista, not a robot, those sorts of things. However, when we talk about empathy being something that you can parlay into economic value, most of that goes into things like sales, leadership, and other things that are not necessarily, there's no physical law that says a human must do those things. If you need to communicate an idea, more often than not, AI is better than a human at this point. If you need to reach out, if you need to cold call someone, again, AI is getting better than humans at that. And so from a business perspective, from a strictly economic perspective, what does the enterprise need? Much of the empathy is going to be things like, negotiation and stuff, but, AI is taking over contract negotiations as well. So while empathy and authenticity and meaning and experience are going to be pretty durable jobs, that's a very small part of the economy. And it's not necessarily part of what most firms, whether it's enterprises or small and medium businesses, are really going to be thinking about. Now, with that being said, they're still going to need some level of brand recognition and spokespersons and those sorts of things. But again, that's a very small portion of the overall organization. So when we do say that, like, strength, dexterity, cognition, and empathy, those are the primary food groups. When you think of it from the perspective of, a large enterprise or even a medium-sized business, it's not necessarily those are not necessarily things that are large moats for humans in the long run.
Currently, at this moment, none of your businesses has access to Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla. The system just needs to be better than Betty and Jimmy. We don't need to have 100% unemployment. We don't need to have everybody's job replaced. We just need to have sufficient disruption to cause harm to the economy and spiral us down. How do we figure out what are the right interventions for businesses that they can maximize the value while making sure that people who will be impacted gain some benefit from this process to the highest degree possible, and then hopefully playing this out across the economy in synchronized with government interventions and family interventions to navigate us all through this successfully.
Humans are short-term animals focused on the here and now. So we people in foresight, we always get the question, when? How fast? Because people tend to delay. So on your current view, what's the time horizon for advanced economies or less advanced economies to move into this truly post-labor phase that is not just a little bit more unemployment, but majorly, massively?
If I had to put money on it, I would say it's all over and done within 20 years, possibly faster than that. But I think more important, it's to talk about the rate of change. And fortunately, while some of these changes that we're talking might appear to be sudden, there's going to be a point at which, okay, this AI is now a very compelling case to replace humans. Again, going back to that institutional inertia, whether it's states or whether it's businesses, it will take time, and we will see some of this coming. Now, the problem that I think is, as you pointed out, people have a lot of what's called normalcy bias, where they say, well, this is the way that I grew up. This is the way that it's always been. It's not going to change. And even people that are in the industry watching the change happen on a month-to-month basis as AI gets better and as robots get better, they all get stuck in this mindset of, well, this is how it's going to be, and it's not going to get any better. It's like, no, it's going to keep changing. And I point this out is because from an evolutionary perspective, we have no emotional affect to understand ongoing change. Our ancestors for many millions of years, even before we were humans, might have lived through a flood or a fire where there's a big giant change and then life settles down again and you rebuild and then things kind of go back to normal. That is why we have normalcy bias. We are not engineered to intuitively understand constant ongoing change, let alone accelerating change. And so, and I know that I'm answering your question kind of sideways. The point is to look at the data, is to keep checking in on the numbers. What level of layoffs are happening? What is the capability of the AI and the machines and the robots? How many are being produced? Particularly when it comes to units of humanoid robots sold, or how many GPUs and how fast are they, and what are the benchmarks that each AI is saturating at this point? That's the front end, saying what's the capability, what's the underlying production level. Then, of course, there's a very big difference between what's possible in the lab and what actually scales in enterprises. And that's what Dalibor and I are working on, which is, okay, how do we scale this? because we want to see this future. Dalibor and I both believe that if we do this right, it'll be good for everyone. It'll be good for businesses. It'll be good for the state. But most importantly, it'll be good for families and individuals and households. But to get from here to there, it's a matter of what do we need to do. So it's not as if people have zero agency in terms of making it happen or adapting or pivoting. Now, to give a couple other milestones that we kind of anticipate, certainly within about 3 years, the near term, that is when AI will almost certainly saturate all cognitive abilities, where you will have Einstein and Nikola Tesla in your pocket at all times within 3 years. Also, they'll have better memory and so on and so forth. Also, within that 3-year horizon, we expect to see humanoid robots be more or less hit product market fit, where they'll be good enough that they're useful for general purpose tasks. Then it's just a matter of bringing that price point down over time as production ramps up. Within about 5 years, so approaching 2030, this is when all of the models that I have run, all the simulations, show that we kind of hit an inflection point where unemployment really starts to pick up speed. So that's where the rate of layoffs will really kind of start to bite. And one thing that I worry about here, and this is the reason that we're doing the work that we're doing, is because the governments around the world, all the parliaments and congresses and whoever else, they're going to assume that this is a cycle. And they're going to react as if it is a cycle. They're going to say, oh, let's change interest rates. Let's do bailout packages. Let's try everything that used to work, and none of it's going to work in the long run. Mark my words. Unemployment's going to keep creeping up, and they're going to say, what do we do? Until it hits to 11%, 15%, 20%, and doesn't go back down. And they're going to realize this is the new normal. So that happens around 2030 to 2032. We expect, based on the numbers that I've run, and of course, it's just numbers, so take it with a grain of salt, but it hits the steepest part of the curve between about 2035 and 2040. So that's when unemployment really starts to tick up. And so then by 2040 to 2042, that's when we're entering kind of the final new normal, where there's a tiny fraction of the workforce is still working. And as we talked about a minute ago, I do anticipate that there's going to be some jobs that stick around forever just because humans are willing to pay a premium for other humans. But of course, in that entire timeline, the AI continues to improve and the robots continue to improve. So if there's not an economic case to be made for a human in the job, they won't be. Simple as that. And I would not be surprised if that's like 2038 to 2040 that we're through the worst of it and kind of in the new normal of the post-labor economy.
The difference between now, this time round, and all previous industrial revolutions was that new technology displaced existing work and then created new jobs. But that's a fallacy this time round, actually. And this is one of the core beliefs that we have. So we have a set of core beliefs in this model called post-labor economics. One of those core beliefs is that new technology doesn't generate jobs out of magical, because that's the force of physics. Instead, what new technology actually does, it frees up capital so that capitalists can redistribute that capital to generate new ideas, new demand. And therefore, it pulls now freed labor into that new type of labor. But the only reason that happens is because up until now, every new technology required humans to operate it. But what we are now getting into, what's coming our way, is we are inventing technology that is genuinely not going to require humans intervening and delivering anything anymore. There is no reason why even those future jobs that will be created that we might not be even able to imagine at this point, if we have a belief that AI systems will be superbly more intelligent, have a better memory, be faster, better, cheaper, and safer, we don't believe that there will be actually new jobs created to absorb the jobs that will be lost. Very practical, right? That's why we think this is important. We might be I hope we are 5 years ahead of the game, because 5 years is enough to bring this conversation up to those who need to hear it. 5 years is enough to follow trends, to confirm what we are saying is going to happen and to put in interventions. This is why I think this is a timely conversation now.
If you tell our clients, well, it's kind of 5 years away, we still got time, they're not going to do anything. So it's urgent because it's already happening. We see the signs. In terms of geography, are there different continents and countries that are affected differently or all at the same time? Is there a sequence?
I don't think there's a particular sequence. I will say that culture does have a pretty outsized impact. And what I mean by that is Americans' appetite for creative destruction means that we're going to be first. And it's going to be messiest here probably, because it's just, throw caution to the wind and automate it. That's what we're famous for. We're very noisy about that. I think that it'll probably be a little bit smoother in Europe just because of Europe's more cautious approach to disruption and stronger labor protections. Some people would worry that, Europe's going to fall behind, which of course that's a possibility. That's often the trade-off. As one of the wealthiest continents on the planet, I think Europe can afford to be, to slow it down a little bit. Another thing that we see in the data is that it's actually developing nations often adapt the fastest. So 2 examples come to mind are India and Brazil. Both of which have already adopted and pioneered some of the interventions that we would recommend, namely around distributed open source payment rails, which is one of the solutions that we recommend to democratize access to banking. And there's a really interesting reason that developing nations are often first movers is because they have an economic imperative to adapt. They don't have the entrenched banking systems and other interests that Europe and America do. And they really just need a problem. They need a solution that will work, whatever it happens to be. So there's often a much higher appetite in developing nations to deploy artificial intelligence and robots and blockchain because it's a mess. And it's more of a mess than it is in Europe or America. So anything that can help to raise the floor is going to be fastest. And I do also get questions about, the global south, which Brazil is part of the global south and India kind of straddles it. But there are concerns about sub-Saharan Africa and other poorer nations that might get completely left behind because artificial intelligence requires cutting-edge GPUs, which are very expensive, and it requires hyperscale data centers, which are very expensive. And America is the world leader of those, and we're not really in a hurry to export any of those technologies right now. So there is some concern. However, one of the things that we've seen in the past is that you end up with these what Peter Diamandis calls PDI, permissionless disruptive innovations. So these are the kinds of innovations like mobile phones that spread like wildfire and cause technological leapfrogs. So an example is all across sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the world now, particularly in underdeveloped or early developing nations, is that mobile phone access gives them access to all kinds of things like digital banking, even though they don't even have modern roads yet. And so that's one of the things that causes me to hold out hope that artificial intelligence and robotics, even if they can't afford the foundries, they'll still probably benefit from the technological dividends that these kinds of innovations yield in the long run. Now, some people might say that sounds pretty thin, Dave. It sounds like you're wishful thinking. But at the same time, there are plenty of people in the open source artificial intelligence realm that are making sure that data is coming from all of those languages so that their culture is represented in the training data for these artificial intelligences. So even though they can't afford to invest in it on their own, there are conscientious people that are ensuring that they're going to be pulled along as well, and that their cultural values and that their language is going to be incorporated into these artificial intelligence training sets, which I think is it's a great start. I have no idea where it's going to go, but it gives me a lot of hope that some of these people, some of the leaders in this area are really taking that responsibility seriously.
So the ultimate end state here, if we pull this correctly, if we pull this right, will be that human labor is going to be displaced by automation and robotics to the point where most likely 20 to 25% of existing labor will continue, but 75% will be displaced permanently. But the good news is that such automation, especially complete full automation, should result in rapid and radical increase in wealth, as automation now suddenly is no longer bound by the bottlenecks of human labor, bottlenecks of capital is being released, redeployed. So what we think is going to happen is that in the next 5 to 7 years, let's say, as we go through this process, individual companies and therefore economies are going to go through very rapid increase in creation of wealth and GDP. That increasing of wealth will have to be somehow distributed across the population to keep population whole and fed. And therefore, the right answer at the end is, how do we actually create a system that preserves the essence of free market capitalism, while at the same time takes this upside of superb wealth generation that is now achieved through automation everywhere to reward the capitalist to the maximum possible stage, while at the same time preserving the cohesion of the rest of the society. Ultimately achieving what now Elon Musk, by the way, has restated the purpose of Tesla, sustainable abundance, what he calls it. Actually, that's, I think, a very, very good way to capture it, what we are talking about. We are talking about achievement of sustainable abundance. I believe that both United States and China completely understand what's happening and have played this movie out into the future and are preparing for what's coming. It's a planetary petri dish where we are going to see which model of governance is going to rule supreme. Is the model of governance that China is promoting, which is central governance, central planning, control of the population, like all of the attributes of Chinese model, is being now compared with all the attributes of the Western liberal democracy, free market economy that America is championing, right? And I think that we are in the middle of that actual competition right now, because they understand that to preserve the peace and prosperity for the population, a lot of new wealth must be generated very, very quickly. Every nation that aspires to benefit from this transition that is, I believe, inevitable, the best thing it can do is to reindustrialize itself as quickly as possible for the forthcoming economy that is upon us, for the automated economy, with the foundation that is energy. So I think that every nation that is now in the process of discussing and thinking, what do we do? The best thing you can do is to mobilize everything you've got to ensure your energy independence and strength, based upon which you can rebuild the actual industry, but for the remainder of the 21st century.
We usually work with and for business leaders. You talk about the economic agency paradox in the book. Companies can automate the labor away and improve efficiency and productivity, but then there might be fewer customers and will be fewer customers with the purchasing power. How should a company address that? How should they think about that? Because we can see it as a governmental problem, as a societal problem, and not care, but most business leaders do. So what should they think about that?
To elaborate on what I call the economic agency paradox is that on the one hand, technology, what it does is it is a deflationary pressure, which lowers the cost of goods and services, which increases your economic agency, because then your money goes further, whether it's dollar or euro or whatever you're using. So that's ostensibly a good thing. But if you take that out to the logical conclusion of where automation gets to the point that you're provisioning those goods and services without human labor, so therefore there's no wages being paid out, the question then becomes, well, how does consumer demand continue to drive the economy if you don't have any household income? Now, the levers that businesses have are relatively limited. You can do things like employee stock option plans, you can do cooperatives, you can do trusts, you can do customer owner agreements and those sorts of things. You can do kickbacks. There's all kinds of little gimmicks and tricks that companies already have. But it will be a larger conversation, which is, do you tax those additional revenues? How do you keep the money circulating? So it's going to be a little bit of both. It's going to be, there is obviously and definitely stuff that companies can do as their margins compress, because again, remember, their competitors are going to be automating as much as possible as well. So there are some options that they have. They can make sure that they pay out dividends to their customers. There's a company here in America, probably elsewhere, REI, that pays dividends to their customers. So it's some kind of return, almost as if buying the products are an investment that you made with them. That's not enough to make ends meet, but it is enough to keep customers coming back. And then there are the larger interventions that we've got outlined in the book that will shore up household income. And so that's things like, universal basic incomes, sovereign wealth funds, and decentralized autonomous organizations, and so on and so forth. So it's going to be, everyone's got something to do. Everyone's got a part to play, whether it's as simple as just paying taxes to ensure that there is some circulation of wealth. But then, yes, there are things that companies can do of their own volition to attract and retain customers in this future paradigm.
Should they also care as much for their lost employees? What's their responsibility there, Dalibor?
That's exactly the crux of the problem. We can identify three groups of people that are that we need to be solving for, right? Typically, in every organization, you would have the group of people whose job is under immediate attack by automation already. Those would be your, customer support jobs, perhaps some relatively, simple, I'm going to call it simple, well-defined tasks that can be performed on a computer in front of a keyboard. Those kind of jobs, let's call them category 1. And those are the jobs that are already able to be displaced, but definitely will be under crosshairs in the next 12 months. The second category is actually what's going to emerge to be the bulk of the rest of the organization. And those are the individuals whom you actually want to make sure are actively participating in the process of automation, with the clarity of understanding that at the end of that process, they are no longer employed. So what do you do with that bulk of employees in order to attract them to participate willingly, enthusiastically, let's say, in making sure that their job gets automated and they leave the organization? So now, what options are there? There are options. There is equity ownership contributions, there are benefits. As a matter of fact, we do have a universal basic income already functioning. It's called retirement and pensions, right? That exists across the world, as a matter of fact. So the question is going to be, how does the ownership group think and engage with the bulk of the employee group that they need to have on board to help them actually rapidly and radically automate? And then what obligations do we have for those individuals, in addition to obvious ones such as retraining and so on and so forth? Do we have an obligation, and how do we construct it so that we convert their employment income into some form of passive ongoing income? And then they're going to have a third group of people. And those are the individuals that you actually want to keep within the organization in the longer run. David mentioned, we believe 20 years is where we are in a new normal completely. So obviously, every ownership group needs to ensure that most essential leaders around them stay. What we're doing is we're actually developing now models and solutions for each one of these three categories of impacted people.
How can we make people to gain and to build ownership of productive, profitable assets? Because usually that takes decades. So even if you help someone who loses the job to a humanoid robot invest in such robots with direct returns or in AI systems, but what are solutions to help people live of their wealth that they usually don't have?
Yeah, that's one of the number one questions that I get when I relay to people that I and others believe that broadening capital participation is the way of the future. Because again, if there's households have three basic buckets where they get money from, which is government transfers in the form of whether it's UBI or assistance or whatever, wages and capital. Well, if wages are going away and you don't want to rely on government transfers, then capital is the primary bottleneck or the primary avenue forward. And if you don't have any to start with, if it takes money to make money, So then your question then is, well, where do we start? So what we've organized in the book is what I call the pyramid of prosperity. And this is nothing more than just a taxonomy. It's a way of organizing the kinds of interventions. So at the baseline of the pyramid of prosperity, you have the universals. So this is universal healthcare, universal basic income, universal internet, those sorts of things, whether it's food assistance or housing assistance or education, whatever. This is value that is provided to citizens by the government, either by taxing and redistributing or through printing money, although not every nation or not every state is able to print money. But you do have some level of redistribution that's available there. The next level is what you might call the sovereign wealth fund level, or the collective assets. So you have Norway's oil fund, you have Alaska's permanent oil or Alaska's permanent fund. You also have the possibility of creating endowments and trusts. Many universities have endowments where they invest money that is given to them, and those dividends can then be used to fund the university or pay for students. There's no reason that can't apply to cities, to provinces, states, and nations as well. And of course, many nations already do that sort of thing. And what you can do is you can either use the proceeds, the dividends from those endowments, to fund the government and then pay for those services, or you can distribute it directly to citizens, as the Alaska Permanent Fund does. So that's another layer. So you have wealth by default, just by virtue of being a citizen of a nation that controls resources. Then the third layer would be collective private assets. And so this is things like trusts, cooperatives, decentralized autonomous organizations. Many of those already exist today, but they don't exist in great numbers. There's a few reasons for that. Number one is regulatory friction, and number two is expertise. So what governments can do is reduce regulatory friction to make it easier to create those vehicles for investment and wealth creation. But then also, if artificial intelligence is good enough to replace most workers, it's probably good enough to also run small trusts and cooperatives, and also decentralized autonomous organizations. So that, in that case, the obstacle becomes the way. And so what you then have is the ability to invest in local farms or data centers or whatever else have you that is going to be revenue producing assets. And furthermore, there's another thing that countries or even states and local governments can do, which is to create tax incentives so that every time you invest in a qualified asset, whether it's a decentralized organization or another enterprise or whatever, you either get a tax break or maybe you even get dollar matching schemes like many retirement accounts do, where if you work at a generous company, one of the things that they do is for every dollar up to a certain number that you contribute to a qualified retirement account, they'll match that number. I see no reason that governments can't do the same, because that incentivizes the discipline and the wealth accumulation that we want to see to broaden that capital participation. So that's layer 3. Layer 4 is conventional private property like we've seen for a long time. Stocks, bonds, businesses, rental properties, whatever else have you. That's something that you own as an individual proprietor. Even a small business still counts there. But the same principle that applies to layer 3 also applies here, which is that we can reduce the regulatory burden to make it easier to do those things, and also create more incentives for accumulation of private property. And then the 5th layer, the top layer, is residual wages. So based on kind of the numbers that we've run, and this is a very, very squishy number, so don't take it as a hard value, but about 10 to 20% of household income in aggregate will still come from wages, even after all is said and done. Now, that's of course a tiny fraction of what it is today, but that's the residual income that will kind of be the cherry on top, that if you do manage to have work, that'll be another source of household income. But the first 4 layers are the bulk of where household income is going to come from. And all of those are geared towards capital-based income rather than labor-based income.
This pyramid that David described, you can see how the middle part of that pyramid, which is shared private property, this is where corporations actually have a role to play. They will be the ones coming up with structures to incentivize their employees to more willingly participate in automation, to incentivize customers to be loyal, and perhaps, so I think the story here is we're going to be atomizing the sources of income into families in the next period, which is different from how it was in the past, where majority of people made majority of income through labor.
I'm planning to buy for every employee robotaxis and then run them together, completely separated from our consulting business, but that's the way I would provide for people. Let's look at the dashboard of a CEO, the financials, the P&L. You said we're going to see deflation, like economic deflation, technological deflation. What are the solutions? What are the products and services? What's a different way to develop, to produce, to sell? How differently should we think about what we sell as companies?
Just thinking about the dashboard, what I want to talk about before we get into like what do you actually sell is what are you measuring? And one of the primary metrics that I would personally track, and this is not the perfect metric, but it's a good starting point, is revenue per employee. As you automate more, you expect revenue per employee to go up. And that's simply because for every employee that you have, they're going to be using more and more AI and automation and robotic automation. And so that means that you should be generating whatever revenue per employee you're generating today, that should go up over time. So that's one of the top line metrics. There's a few other metrics that you could track, but that's my personal favorite one, just because what we see already is that highly automated businesses and highly scalable businesses, they have a higher revenue per employee on average already. So we expect that trend to continue. Now, in terms of the goods and services that you sell, one thing that I would be concerned about is is areas where the competition is going to make margins razor thin. And these are going to be places that you would not necessarily expect. So for instance, law firms, I have friends that are attorneys, they already use AI quite a bit, so they don't even hire paralegals anymore. Well, what could happen, because law is entirely text-based and filings-based and cognition-based, is that the margins for law firms might continue to shrink quite a bit until it's basically, you're only the partners at the firm and then the subscription service that they have to the AI tools. And then the only reason that they have a job is because they are licensed to be a lawyer. So that's an example of something to watch out for. Now, in terms of what I would sell or what you could sell, is one of the golden rules right now is when there's a gold rush, sell the pickaxes and the shovels. So if you're selling energy, so this goes back to what Dalibor said earlier, if you're able to sell energy, that demand for that is only going to go up. If you're able to sell GPUs or compute or host GPUs and compute, again, demand for that is only going to go up. And those are a few ideas off the top of my head. Dalibor, I don't know if you have any additional ideas for what you can monetize in this future.
There will be 3 phases that are likely going to unfold on this path to full maximum automation. The first phase is dumb automation or robotic process automation that has been around for 15 years. So that's a first layer of automation that if your business has not looked for opportunities to automate dumbly, would be step number 1. Like, that's a prerequisite now. We are now entering actively into phase 2, which we call augmentation, as in you are pairing your human worker with an AI system that enables them, that makes their tasks done better, faster, cheaper, and safer. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? You see, this is what's happening. This is what's happening now. The third phase is a full transformation. That's where you can actually scope the work and fully automate it without a need to have an employee perform the work. You might still need an employee to provide validation, sign off, and oversight. Those are the 3 waves that I think we are going to see. We are now, I think, entering the augmentation wave. But those who are first movers are actively looking at opportunities across all 3. Then the next question becomes, okay, so what do I do? How do I think about this holistically? And our suggestion is to actually think about it from 2 approaches, a spear approach and peanut butter approach. There are peanut butter things you can do to spread across your whole enterprise. such as let us change the mindset of our leaders. Let us educate our employees. Let us empower and encourage them. Let us raise their curiosity and then give them tools so that they can do their jobs spectacularly better, faster, cheaper, and safer. So that's a peanut butter approach that creates value for the enterprise as for everybody. And then there are spears. And spears are individual actions that are intended to remove your bottlenecks that you currently have or friction points that you currently have in your business using AI automation, right? So we think that ultimately this is going to be an orchestration of peanut butter activities to change the mindset, get people curious, educated, ready how to use technology, combined with spears to keep hitting at your bottlenecks and friction points, while keeping in mind that there are 3 different phases of automation available: dumb automation, augmentation, and intelligent automation. And then just getting out doing it. Just getting out and doing it. Taking the first advantage now with also appreciation. One more thing that I think is really important. Nobody really knows where this ends. So with the appreciation that this is high risk, high reward proposition, right? And that we will all be learning along the way.
What do you think about entrepreneurs, business leaders who, as I do, tell my team, hey, people, we can stay together, but there are a couple of prerequisites. First, each one of you needs to become a master in using AI. Develop your own custom GPTs, your own models, your own training data to improve your productivity. Because when we think just in efficiency, it's always less people, less work, less time. When we think in productivity, then it's about creating more value. It's about creating more quality of life out there. And that means we need to grow. Not everybody's going to manage to grow. But I made this promise pretty explicitly. Am I dumb? Am I crazy?
I would say no. That this is very common, particularly for smaller businesses where you've probably already selected for bright people that are very dynamic and good at learning. I have friends that are entrepreneurs, and they've all basically made the same bargain that they have no intention of laying anyone off, but the expectation is that over the next 6 months you're going to at least double your productivity, and then over the next year you're going to 10x your productivity, and again and again and again. And this is something that Dalibor and I have both found, is that we're effectively running what would have taken a small team, but we're doing it as solopreneurs today. Now, what I will say is, while that is a wonderful sentiment, and it definitely works, because when you can 20x your individual productivity, I don't need a team anymore. Dalibor and I work together, and that's enough. We use AI all day, every day to do our research, to do whatever else we need. However, when you scale up to larger institutions, whether it's enterprises or universities or governments, many of the employees are not that dynamic. Just by default, you hire someone to punch a lever, pull a lever, or whatever else have you, and many people are either unable or unwilling to retrain or upskill. And in fact, the numbers show that people don't really like lateral career changes. Many people would prefer to stay in their exact career or be unemployed. And so there's a lot of resistance to those kinds of changes. And furthermore, when you look at a large institution or larger institution, it doesn't even have to be a gigantic one, just a few hundred employees. In many cases, the value streams are so well defined around a human doing a job that any change, any refactoring of those value streams and those outcomes is just going to invalidate even the need for that person. And so, yes, those 200 to 700 person organizations, they might trim down to 50 to 100. And so, yes, the 50 to 100 remaining people, that's the category 3 that Dalibor pointed out, which is those are the people that you can upskill, that you can retrain, that can become AI masters, and very high leverage individuals. What I would say, though, and the reason I'm saying this is, yes, you absolutely want to become a high leverage individual, and you want to cultivate high leverage individuals. but that's not going to be viable or scalable for all organizations, and certainly not all employees. I don't believe so.
So how should leaders then talk to their people? How should they communicate about this transition without either sugarcoating or creating panic and paralysis?
That is a very difficult question, and I don't envy people that have to have that conversation. Dalibor, I think you've put a little more thought into that as you've got the enterprise experience. So I'll punt to you because I don't want to answer that.
Well, the reason why we're building the framework is to fundamentally address that exact question. The upside is obvious. The upside is grotesque. We actually use the word grotesque to describe the upside. The challenge is, what do we do with people? How do we keep people whole to the greatest degree possible? And that'll be the hard one. My general advice would be that this needs to be approached with candor, transparency, empathy, and compassion. And that should drive us. Empathy, compassion, but also transparency and candor. That'll be my starting point. Before this conversation happens, the ownership group needs to have very, very good internal reflections and discussions in order to explore different choices and avenues at their disposal that maybe give them an opportunity to provide some incentives to the employees while not harming the business itself. Like you can actually over-rotate and harm the health of your business too by over-rotating, but actually doing the right analysis, doing the right simulations and projections that helps you identify the path that you are willing and able to take. In that path, you will be explicitly asked to understand how we're going to address category of employees one, which is those are the retainers, the ones that stay. What are you going to do with those that are unfortunately already displaced? You just haven't acted on it. And then the bulk, which is in the next 5 years, all of this is going to be automated. We need everybody on board with us. But I think, as I said, I'm going to repeat it 3 times because this is really important. Transparency, candidness, empathy, and compassion.
If a CEO asks you, what should I tell my children or young talent about building a meaningful, future-proof life in a post-labor economy?
So I get asked this question quite a bit. Even it's really interesting because as I'm talking to business leaders who are like, yes, AI, it sounds really cool because that's my expertise, and they're like, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to tell my children. And I've given talks at universities, and of course I get the same question from students that are about to graduate. And what I say to everyone is that communication skills in all their forms are the most valuable skill that you can possibly have. Whether it is difficult conversations, that applies at home, it applies at work, whatever your job happens to be. If you want to be famous on the internet, the number one job for Gen Z is they all want to be YouTubers. Having done that, communication is the number one skill. Being on camera, expressing yourself, negotiation is another kind of communication skill. Nonverbal, whether it's presentation skills, digital communication, all of those, that is the single most valuable and high leverage cluster of skills you can possibly have. So if your goal is to have a good life, being able to express yourself, if you're frustrated with your spouse or your kids or whatever, being able to work through those difficult conversations, the same skills that apply at home apply in business, whatever the job happens to be. And so that's my go-to. Just if I could tell my 15-year-old self, double down on communication skills, most valuable skill set you can possibly have.
In addition to communication, which I agree is number one, I would say number 2 is resilience. Number 3 is curiosity. And I think that the success going forward through this transition will be in that combination of communication excellence, curiosity, and resilience.
I was going to ask you, what are people going to do? That's what many people worry about. I'm not really concerned about this because we have phases in life where we don't really work, and we have hobbies, and we have people to care for. So I'm not really worried about this, but many people are.
The metaphor that I use is a divorce. So we're about to go through a really bad divorce. There's labor on one side, and then there's capital on the other. And so we're unhappy, right? We've been unhappy for a long time because most people are burned out or checked out. Only globally, it's only about 20% of employees are engaged, which is abysmal. So clearly it's not working. Even with more productivity, even with cool technology, doesn't matter. Across the board, people are burned out and they're ready for a change. However, like anyone who's been through a divorce, you don't want to imagine life after. It's very difficult to imagine, could I possibly be happier? Is the grass actually greener on the other side? Or do I just stick with the devil that I know? Or do I just take comfort in the familiar? However, for anyone who's been through the process, you know that the grass actually can be much greener on the other side. And what we're really doing right now is we're just working through the paces of negotiating what alimony is going to look like, because right now we need the wages. Right now, capital also needs the labor. It's kind of a love-hate relationship, and for many people, because again, going back to that, only 20% of people are engaged. And by the way, some of the people that are actively disengaged are sabotaging their employers. So there's a lot of mutual acrimony going back and forth. So we all want a way out, but we need a way out that is going to be sustainable for both sides. Because if we try and decouple right now, business isn't ready because they still rely on employees, and labor is not ready because we don't have an alternative to household income. So what we really need is that way of that credible exit to move forward. So that's really kind of the starting point. Another metaphor that I use for how to approach life afterwards is the river versus the garden. So the river model of life is you go to school, you get a job, or maybe you go to college, you get a better job, you get married, you settle down, you have children, you go through your career, you save for retirement, then you retire, and away you go. And everyone is supposed to follow that same path. Well, the reason that path exists is because it's the most economically efficient path, and a lot of legislation and other social paradigms are organized around that life path. However, when you're not in the channel, when you're not in the river mentality, you can switch to a garden mentality. And the garden mentality is I can go anywhere and do anything today that I want. So where do I allocate my time and attention and energy? And what that mindset changes you to saying, okay, how am I going to get the most meaning or the most benefit from today for my life? And so rather than thinking, how am I going to benefit by just getting money to survive? If that's taken care of in this future, then you can think, well, what's the most meaningful thing I can do today? And if you have children, it might be, I'm going to teach my children to play a new game, or, take them to, the Air and Space Museum, or whatever it happens to be. You're going to have more time to do that. Other people might spend more time volunteering or, engaging in politics, whatever it happens to be. And the reason that I use a garden is because a garden has no specific form. You just choose a bunch of plants and you cultivate those plants, whether it's tomatoes and peppers or flowers, whatever it happens to be. You get to pick and choose what you grow in your garden. And so then on any given day, you say, you know what, I'm going to pay more attention to my health today, or I'm going to pay more attention to my kids today, or I'm going to pay more attention to my community, the next day. So that is how I teach people to really think about what's the difference between the river mentality that we're all stuck in right now and switching to the garden mentality. And I came up with this metaphor a couple of years ago when I was on one of my daily hikes, and I was thinking about, how do I communicate this idea? And I hiked beside a river, and I was like, this river is like people's lives. There's a beginning and it all ends in the ocean when you die, right? So I was like, but what if there's a different metaphor for life? And I was like, well, how am I engaging life now? I have my research, I have my dogs, I have, my fiction and hobbies and all my friends and stuff. And I was like, the way that I approach life right now is more like that garden, where I have just these different interests kind of planted around my life, and none of them has any particular goal or form. It's just where I want to allocate my time and energy and attention in that given day. And there's a lot of other psychology and science to back all of this up, but those are the two primary metaphors. Is first, the messy divorce that we're all avoiding and kicking the can down the road. And then there's switching to the garden mentality from the river mentality.
Dalibor, is then meaning the major challenge?
That is going to be what we all individually redefine as our purpose. And I've been actively thinking about this. When I looked at, my last 20 years of intense career focus, what was I doing actually? What was I feeding? I was feeding my need for status, and I was feeding my need for wealth, right? So now, going forward, imagine the scenario where wealth is not now, at the end state. Wealth is no longer really a question. So what do I do now? I think that what I know now is what is replacing already, because David and I actually, we already live in this future. Actually, the way we organized our affairs, we are already there, right? So what I'm personally experiencing is that desire for impact and pleasure and leisure supersede or has supplanted that desire for more status and more wealth. So to me, that everybody's going to go through their own personal version of this and land to where they feel good. Pero, we are talking now about farther future than immediate business discussion. But how I would invite people to think about it, if they don't know what will they do with all this time, is to just ask yourself these three questions. Imagine suddenly you have a vacation that came up for the next 2 weeks. You will be staying home, you're not sick, you're well, you're not traveling, you're staying home, and the checks are coming. What would you do for the next 2 weeks, right? And people would find things to do, right? Now, same question, but imagine that vacation now has been prolonged for 3 months. What would you do? Would you pick a new hobby? Imagine all of your friends are also on that 3 months vacation at the same time. What would you do? And now imagine if that just kept going. What would that life look like? So here is an interesting proposition here. We now can see a clear trajectory from this moment to that moment. We can even estimate how long will this take us if we don't screw it up collectively as a society, as a civilization, if we don't end up in a war, for example, right? We can clearly see it. And that target state is so good, it's so compelling, that I think we should all join forces across all political spectrums to make this reality as quickly as we can. And post-labor economics, if you actually think about it, is uniquely positioned to fulfill both capitalists' and socialists' objectives. If we pull this right, the capitalist will extraordinarily multiply their capital and wealth. And at the same time, when that wealth is properly and equitably distributed to keep the society together, the socialist objective will also be met. So we have an opportunity to bring all political forces together to work together on solving this, and therefore do this transition as quickly as possible, tearing it off like a band-aid, instead of prolonging this potentially miserable process for people over many, many years. This is where I think business leaders have a role to play. To say, you know what, we need to aggressively double down on this to force this through, so that at the end of the day, everybody benefits.
When I talk about the necessity of ownership of productive assets, people ask me, well, that sounds like a Marxian idea, right? And it kind of does. It's in a different way, but it kind of does. In a recent video, I painted 3 scenarios. One is the horror scenario, like everything implodes. Then we have the abundance scenario, which is everybody is well off, everybody's even rich, universal high income, as Elon says. And a crisis scenario that's in the middle. Actually, what I believe is we'll all end up in the abundance scenario eventually. What is the trajectory that you see? So is this a U-shaped transition as we had it like 200 years ago with the Luddites and the revolutions starting from 1848? Or is it a linear curve? How are we going to manage to make that transition?
The way that I tend to organize it is I look at attractor states, or kind of like what are the buckets that we might fall into. So imagine that you've got, a series of buckets and you throw a ping pong ball, like which one is it going to bounce into? And then once you get stuck in one of those, you might stay there, or it can be hard to bounce back out. So the default trajectory, where we're heading right now, when you combine neoliberalism and modern free markets and all the institutional policies that are built around that, the assumption of labor, this is one of the most dangerous assumptions, the assumption that labor is going to be around forever. We're heading off the rails, and that I would call a dystopia. So high tech, low life, or techno feudalism. You will own nothing and be happy. Everything is a rentier economy. That's the direction that we're going right now, which is why this work is necessary. If I thought that it was going to sort itself out, I wouldn't be working on the book. There's lots of other problems that I looked at that I think that the market is going to work itself out. AI safety, that's one that I think that people are taking seriously. So I was like, I don't need to contribute to that. It's a self-solving problem. This one doesn't look like a self-solving problem to me right now. So the default trajectory is that we're going to end up probably not as bad as, you see in the movie Elysium or Blade Runner, but that's the direction we're heading, where, corporate power continues to grow and most people don't have a job and most people are just trying to scrounge a living. And then the revolving door between business and state ends up just a complete, spiral of corruption. I think that is a very real possibility, where you could end up with, gated communities of the super wealthy, and everyone else is kind of living outside the gated communities. I would like to avoid that. Another attractor state is kind of the Civil War model that you've talked about. And we've seen this happen plenty of times throughout history, from the fall of Tsarist Russia to the French Revolution to the Arab Spring to China's Great Leap Forward. We have seen repeatedly throughout history that if economic conditions and people get too disempowered, eventually they rise up in revolt, usually violently. We've seen several other nations, from Myanmar to Nepal, have smaller revolutions. That is also well within the realm of possibility, because if people get angry enough, people will tolerate a lot of things. They will not tolerate being hungry. If people get hungry for too long, they get violent. Why? Because you choose between starving to death or, picking up a gun or a knife and choosing violence. You're going to take, it might be a last ditch effort, but you're going to take that option. Those two possibilities, we have plenty of evidence historically showing, like we could get stuck where the rich get richer, because we saw that as far back as ancient Rome, where Crassus ended up owning most of the good farmland. And that was part of the reason that the Republic switched to the empires, because it became so top heavy. And we've seen that kind of pattern of power begets more power, wealth begets more wealth. So those are two very likely attractor states. Hopefully we can avoid that. So then there's, another attractor state is, if you manage to avoid those, you tend to slide more towards compounding returns, where democracy gets stronger, redistribution and pre-distribution get stronger. And that leads to more or less the same place, where we have abundance, we have sharing, whatever you call it, whether you call it capitalism 2.0 or fully automated luxury space communism, whatever you call it, it ultimately looks kind of the same, where democracy is stronger with the help of AI and blockchain and robots, not weaker, not an authoritarian surveillance state. And then also people's standard of living and social mobility also continues to go up. Because if you look at this in terms of first principles, you say, okay, how do you characterize a dystopia on numbers? You say your standard of living is low and probably declining. You say your social mobility is also low and possibly declining, meaning, you're going to be poorer next year than you are this year, and you're stuck in a permanent underclass. And so those are two kind of ways of characterizing. So what you want to see is where the gradient is going the other way, where over time your social mobility and quality of living are going up, whether or not you're doing anything to contribute to it. That's the attractor state that we want to get to. So I guess I would put it into three buckets, where you have like the more utopian side, the more dystopian side, and then the Civil War side, or the disaster side. Those are kind of the three big categories. There's probably different flavors within each of those three categories, but that's where I'd put it. What about you, Dalibor?
Mo Godat, who was the CEO of Google X, he describes this I think in a very reasonable way. He says that he expects there will be a short-term dystopia that will ultimately lead us to a long-term utopian end state, right? That we will go through the process collectively. I think we're going through the stages of grief collectively, right? As we go through this divorce that David is describing, there will be shock, there will be disbelief, there will be bargaining, right? Eventually, there will be realization. And then I think as we go through that process, if we pull this off properly, we are going to end up at that stage of sustainable abundance. So to me, I think that we need to be very mindful that next 5 to 10 years are going to be very critical. We need to make sure that we take a balanced view and we reserve some of our compassion for other humans who are going to need that compassion. We need compassion, so will they. Everybody will, right? So I think that we need to start thinking and talking about that. Like I said, regardless of who you are, where were you born, what religion you follow, what language you speak, what your political spectrum. This here, I think, is a civilizational species-like transformation that is upon us. We believe it's irreversible. We believe it's actually end up very well, and that we should all come together and make sure that we plow through this dystopian part quickly, hold it together, and end up in a good state.
Our listeners are entrepreneurs, business leaders. What are things that they should stop doing immediately? And what are things that they should start doing, like beliefs, habits, guidelines, principles, whatever it is? So first the don'ts.
The don'ts. I would say don't or stop deluding yourself. There are many people out there. It's not just business leaders, but there are many people that are kidding themselves when they think that artificial intelligence and robotics are not going to be transformative. So I would say don't kid yourself. Don't stick your head in the sand. Like, look at reality as it's coming at you, because if you fall behind, it might not be recoverable for many businesses. So that's my primary don't.
What's the do?
My do is going to be start investing. And I don't necessarily mean dollars. I mean time, energy. The most successful organizations that I have consulted for, that we are talking to, are the ones where the CEO uses the AI more than anyone else. And the reason is because they have the clearest understanding as to what this technology can and cannot do. And even if they're not using every single tool, if they're in it every day, they say, okay, I get this, I understand the value, then they become the biggest executive sponsor, regardless of how big the company is. Because, I mean, I have friends that have, small 7-person companies. We've talked to executives at 700-person companies. The ones where the executive leaders use it the most, they are the most successful in making this transition, rather than just telling someone else, oh, go figure this out for me. No, you need to lead from the front with artificial intelligence. So that's the primary do. All right, Dalibor, you can take it away.
First, curiosity. Lean in to actually understand what is going on. Don't just listen to the news. Get yourself seriously involved in understanding what has actually happened. And how is what has happened fundamentally different? At some point, I came to the realization that what has actually happened is not dissimilar to having aliens land on Earth. Super intelligent aliens have landed on Earth. Right? This is not a better software. This is different. So first thing is curiosity. Be well informed. There is a handful of people. This is actually not easy, not difficult. This is not difficult. There are a handful of people who are at the forefront of thinking, who are regularly active, present, and available, and talk about this daily. And there's a whole spectrum of individuals with different mindsets and perspectives, from those who are talking about this is a doomsday catastrophe that's upon us, to those who deny that this is anything big, and to those who actually believe that this is fully transformative. So be curious, learn. Second, establish a career scaffolding support network. Mingle. What David and I are doing is we are creating an opportunity to actually bring owners together in a cohort forum, so that as we progress through this, we progress through this together. So build a group of friendlies that you can trust. Include some sharp, provocative, thought leaders, creators who can help provoke and champion the conversation, but learn from each other. To me, those are the two do's, right? The don't is the same as David's. Don't is just stop deluding yourself. Past performance is not indication of the future results, quote unquote, right?
That was a wonderful and inspiring conversation, but still we just scratched the surface compared to what is in the book. When is it going to be published?
I am actively in final revisions, so we're still targeting early to mid 2026.
And it's going to be available from Amazon?
We're going to make sure it's available everywhere as digital, audiobook, and of course, paperback, hardback. All of the above should be available everywhere.
To shorten that time for leaders who want to get deeper into post-labor economics, your work, the great decoupling, what should they read, hear, or watch next? What and whom should they follow?
I've got a Substack series. So if you just go to my Substack, daveshap.substack.com, one of the categories is post-labor economics. So I post thoughts there. I also have a community on LinkedIn and also Twitter for post-labor economics. Although those are more kind of scattershot. Then there's also the YouTube, various platforms. I have channels, and then I also do plenty of podcast interviews, and I have I repost everything on my Spotify as well. So if anyone wants to learn more, there's all that. And then, of course, they can link up with me and Dalibor for direct consultation as another option.
Dalibor, where should people follow you?
Probably the simplest way would be to actually connect with me on LinkedIn and also follow my YouTube channel, which is called Tectonic Conversations, which currently now has actually a series of 6 episodes that are directly mapped to David Shapiro's book. So if anyone wants to understand at a deeper level what will be read in the book once it's published, David and I had pretty much 6 hours of that conversation over the last 3 months. And it's all recorded and posted on Tectonic Conversations, but also on David Shapiro's PLE for Post-Labor Economics YouTube channel, PLE YouTube channel.
And there's still more in the book, right? People need to have the reason.
Yeah, we have been refining the conversation, but the book is the unequivocal single source of truth for every model that we're talking about.
Thanks, guys. As I've been writing under my emails, have a bright future. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Become a member of the Bright Future Leaders, our community for forward-thinking leaders, all for free. We share foresight, strategies, methods, and tools that help you create strategic clarity, competitive strength, execution power, and joy for the future in your team and in your company. We do interviews as well as live talks by me, my colleagues, and other inspiring experts. The link is in the description. Feel free to invite fellow leaders from your network to join us. Have a bright future.